Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to kick things off today. My name is Emma. I'm the Events Officer at Hope for the Future. I'm also joined this morning on the call by my colleagues Laura, Josh and Hannah. I don't want to speak for too long as we've got a really exciting but a very packed schedule to get through this morning. But I'm just going to give you a bit of an intro to today's session. If you haven't heard of us already, Hope for the Future is a climate communications charity which works nationally to equip communities and individuals to communicate the urgency of climate change with their local politicians. We feel it's vitally important that MPs and constituents have rich and challenging conversations about the climate crisis. As part of our work, we support individuals and groups to organise local events with their MPs. And that's what brings us here today. And we really look forward to welcoming Charlotte Nichols, local MP for Warrington North, to the event at about 11 o'clock today. So this is the event that we have for you. I just want to start by briefly talking you through our schedule and the themes that we'll be covering today. We're all becoming more and more aware that the threat that climate change poses to businesses, not just in the UK, but all over the world. And that's where we'll be starting from with today's presentations. I'm delighted to say that we're joined by Ben Tolhurst from Business Declares, who will be highlighting the risks that businesses are facing as a result of the climate crisis. However, we don't want to spend too much of our time this morning focusing on the negatives, but we want to focus on what we can do to address the challenges that we're facing, as there are also significant opportunities for businesses who want to play a role in responding to this global threat. Therefore, Ben will spend much of his talk this morning looking at the opportunities that exist for businesses and highlighting some actions that your organisation could take. We'll continue in this vein as we hear from our collaborators on this event at the Environment Partnership. We're so delighted to be joined by their directors, Katie Shilcock and Frances Hesketh, who'll be taking us through the journey that the organisation's been taking over the last 11 years to manage the company's impact on the environment. And that includes their motivations for action, the obstacles they faced on the way, and their plans for the future as they aim for net zero. Hopefully this will be a really positive case study for those of you who are already embarking on or are looking to plan your own carbon neutral journey. So lastly, we'll be joined by Signe Norberg from the Aldersgate Group and local MP for Warrington North, Charlotte Nichols. Signe will set the scene for the final part of our event, looking at the support that businesses need to reach these ambitions, as well as the role of government in reducing emissions in the business sector. This will take us, Signe will take a specific focus on the policies that businesses need to be implemented by the government in order to get on the road to net zero. Then before we head into the Q&A, facilitated by my colleague Laura, we'll hear from MP Charlotte Nichols, who also sits on the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Committee. And Charlotte will be looking further at the role that businesses need to play in the government's current plans to reach net zero and discussing what support is needed from the government at a national and local level to facilitate this. So it's quite a packed schedule, so let's crack on. So just before I stop talking and hand over to our speakers, some housekeeping before we start. This webinar will be recorded and available on demand for you to watch again and share. We'll be sending all of our attendees a follow-up email tomorrow with a link to this recording and directing you to Hope for the Future's latest resources. We'll also be signposting you to some key resources from our speakers, and we'd encourage you to get in touch and let us know if your organisation would like support in outlining your climate plan, and we can signpost you to who would be best to do that, or if you'd like support in engaging your elected representatives further on support to achieve those plans. We'll be doing our absolute best to stick to time, and we're scheduled to finish before 12 o'clock today, and we'll absolutely make sure the rest of your afternoon is free. Finally, I would just like to ask that everyone be respectful of the contributions given in today's event, both from our speakers, but also from your fellow attendees in the chat. And speaking of the chat, we'd really encourage you to get involved in today's session by using the chat function at the bottom of your screen. I'd really like to encourage any of you who are on the event this morning to use that space now to introduce yourself, tell us what kind of organisation you're from, and let us know what you're hoping to get out of today's webinar. We really want to make sure that this event is shaped by you. Also on your dashboard, you'll see a question box. Please post your questions for our speakers in the Q&A box as we go through the event today. Those of you who don't post questions, you can also upvote the questions that other people put in the box. And you can do that by clicking the little thumbs up icon next to any question you'd like to hear an answer to. For any questions we don't get to today, we've had some submitted in advance as well. We'll collate these and see if we can get our speakers to provide us with some written response and get that sent out to you. You can also get involved on social media using the hashtag HFTFWEBINAR, and you can see our various social media handles are listed on the screen for Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. So please do follow us and get in touch. Finally, at the end of today's session, a feedback form will pop up in your browser. So please take the time to fill this in. It's really, really short, and it's just a massive help for us in evaluating how we run these kind of events. So without further ado, I'll pass on to our first speaker this morning, Ben Tolhurst. Ben joins us in his capacity as Director for Business Declares. Business Declares is a not-for-profit organisation that acts as a critical friend to organisations who are seeking to change their business models and take positive steps to address the current current environmental crisis. Ben also leads the property and asset management business for JLL in the UK, and his background spans 27 years in the outsourced sector. He's also worked on a number of industries, including government, energy and utilities, telco and property. So Ben's going to kick us off this morning by giving us an overview of the risks that climate change poses to businesses in the UK. But more importantly, as I said before, he's going to be exploring those opportunities that it presents for business. So many thanks for joining us this morning, Ben. I'm going to pass over to you now.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Emma. Hopefully you can hear me okay. So thank you for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here today. So yes, I've worked in the outsourcing sector for pretty much all of my time with blue chip organisations, from government to telcos and everything in between. I'm currently a UK board member for JLL, which is one of the largest corporate real estate organisations, where I lead the property and asset management business. Interestingly, I have no background in sustainability whatsoever, and I can only say what I can describe as a climate epiphany, which I had in February of 2019, which resulted in some pretty major changes in my personal and indeed professional life. So that epiphany led me, from a personal perspective, within 9 months, amongst other things, I had adopted a vegan diet, I decarbonised my pensions and savings, I had stopped flying. From a professional perspective, I guess I adopted a kind of role of an agitator. So I presented to the UK board a pack on climate science. I developed a training pack, which we delivered to several hundred staff and clients actually in the UK. And importantly, I became a kind of role model for legitimising the conversation around climate and ecological breakdown in the workplace, which, let's face it, is often a bit of an awkward conversation, or something that with a corporate facade on, well, one isn't confident in talking about. I also joined Business Declares during that time, which is a not-for-profit organisation, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. And I guess in my ultimate act of employee activism, I recruited my successor and I quit my job. So from the 1st of May this year, I will dedicate all of my time to raising awareness about the climate and ecological breakdown among citizens, employees, businesses, and most importantly, supporting organisations and their people to take action. If we move on to the next slide, the challenges for organisations. So I'm just going to say one quick thing about this, and then I'm going to move on to opportunities, because as everyone here today will be aware, this climate crisis is causing a whole range of material impacts in the business sector. Our very immediate impact, of course, is COVID, a zoonotic disease, of which there are thousands, and these spread from animal to humans. And scientists have known about these for a long time and have been warning us about the risk in the way that we treat nature. For example, things like intensive agriculture, deforestation, habitat destruction, all of which impact climate change. What we are experiencing in this pandemic is ultimately the outcomes of how we have treated nature. And perhaps less immediate for some businesses than COVID, but no less alarming, in fact more so, is the impending impacts from extreme weather. These might be felt indirectly or through companies in supply chains, whether this be scarcity of components, products, foods, or having stranded assets. So it's pretty natural to feel powerless, to feel overwhelmed. But actually, we as human beings are capable of huge change, huge adaptation, moving impossible to possible. Look at how we rebuilt the country after the Second World War. Look at how firms retooled their manufacturing during COVID. So although we have a pretty massive challenge, the biggest of our lives, we do also have the ingenuity, we also have the money, we also have the ability to address these, but we need the will of governments behind it. So I'm going to move on to talk about some very specific elements of opportunity for businesses, and look at this from a positive standpoint. And we have 5. So if I can move into the first one, people. The first thing to say here is that if a business wants to have any chance of competing for top talent, it needs to adopt a credible stance on climate crisis. New talent entering the workforce, and I'm thinking particularly of the Generation Zs, are having an increasing focus on purpose-led organisations, and survey after survey tell us this, and there's a couple of examples there. So the question for organisations is, well, what things might we do to attract staff and win in this war for talent, or at least compete in this war for talent? So as long as as well as having a purpose-driven ethos, which is actually, it does have to be genuine and credible, there are some really gritty, down-to-earth actions that organisations can take to attract and retain staff. A few examples I'm just going to throw in. So making it easy for staff to switch to green energy at home, because the home is now fast becoming the workplace. It's been the workplace for many for the last year, and it will remain the workplace for some going forward. And one organisation, for example, has offered their staff £200 or a day off for everyone that adopts 100% green tariff. In JLL, where we have 8,000 employees, we're running a campaign called The Big Switch, which is a way of helping employees get to a green tariff with minimum effort from their perspective. Things like flying. One organisation is just banning all flights. If I look at what we're doing in JLL, if you can get somewhere in 4.5 hours on a train, obviously no one's travelling right now, but this came in before COVID, then you don't fly. So there was a no flight policy for that duration on a train. And that means London to Scotland flights are in effect not able to be taken anymore. And another organisation is extending the concept into people's holiday choices. So if somebody is prepared to go to France by train rather than fly, that organisation will make up the lost time for that travel by giving them extra days, for example. There are a huge amounts of those gritty types of activities, policies that are hugely appealing to a number of individuals and will cause people to be attracted and indeed stay. And again, on the slide, there's some other examples of some organisations. If I can move on to products, there's nothing like a crisis for driving innovation. So products which are seen as ethical, products which are seen to support climate emergency are hugely on the rise. So it's 1 in 4 food products launched in 2019 were labelled vegan. From the Greggs sausage roll to the Beyond Burgers, the Impossible Burgers, and a whole range of other products. Tesla, possibly one of the most iconic green, in inverted commas, products with their electric cars. And you can see that Unilever, from the example here, is driving a whole range of different growth from their B corporations. There's also sort of individual products coming on the market. So EcoVens, the vending machine where you put in your plastic bottle, it gets crushed, it gets recycled, and for your efforts you get some vouchers which you can spend in the shopping centre where that machine exists, for example. So there's a whole load of innovation going on there, and whilst the climate emergency is clearly a huge challenge for everybody, there are opportunities from a product base to actually help both with the environment as well as the business. The third slide I want to talk about, the next one, is profit. So as well as top line, there is also opportunity to be had in bottom line growth. So whether these be diversifying energy, switching to renewables, choosing electric fleets, there are a whole load of examples, and I've just put a few on there from BT, Unilever, Carlsberg. They've literally saved hundreds of millions because they've been forced to rethink their energy use. And of course, the knock-on of that is that staff, when they go home, actually start to think about their energy use as well. If I move on to the next one, which is resilience, whether you call this an opportunity or a threat depends on your viewpoint, I guess. But by focusing on the climate and ecological breakdown, organisations will start to force themselves to develop greater resilience for their business. And understanding the climate resilience of a business has huge advantages. So things like the valuation of your assets, things like pricing volatility, things like supply chain stability, having a better awareness of these puts businesses in a far better place. There are a huge number of different ways of measuring this climate resilience. Probably the most well-known is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD, as it was called, which is voluntary, but something like this, or indeed this, will become mandatory over time. So it's a good basis, I guess, in which to appraise the business that you run and the climate risks associated with it. And then finally, investments, the final slide. You know, in a nutshell, if you're looking to raise money, if you're looking to attract investors, be they public or institutional investors, having a sustainability, having a green focus will be more advantageous than not. And whether it's the FT, Goldman Sachs, Bloomberg, or any other analysts, the opinion and the evidence all seems to be heading one way. Basically, that impact investing in low carbon intense organizations will continue to lead the way on financial performance. So I guess just in summary on this section, despite the seemingly insurmountable challenge we have ahead of us, there is the ingenuity, there is the money, there are the great minds to actually help address those challenges, but also uncover opportunities for businesses. And I've highlighted 5 areas where those opportunities may exist. If I just move on to business declares now, which is the next one, please. Thank you. Yes, I mentioned in my introduction that as part of my climate epiphany and the various things I did, I looked to join a not-for-profit organisation with a real purpose on helping businesses to raise awareness, to become more knowledgeable, I guess, of this issue and do stuff about it. So Business Declares, not-for-profit organisation, there are individuals from a whole range of different background sectors, big and small businesses, experienced, younger volunteers. And I suppose we recognise that business has a massive part to play in tackling the climate and ecological crisis that we're in the midst of. And Business Declares exist to raise awareness of this agenda, as I mentioned, and as I mentioned, most importantly, accelerate action in tackling this issue. So we do this in a number of ways. We act as a convener of dialogues, working with networks or other organisations. So earlier this year, we put on a dialogue on the CEE bill and advocating that businesses sign up to and support the CEE bill. Caroline Lucas was one of the speakers amongst some other business leaders as well. So we convene dialogues around specific important topics relating to the climate. We also act as an agitator, critical business friend to explore edgy dilemmas. So things like the supply chain, scope 3. What is scope 3? How do you manage it? How do you work with the supply chain? Might be an example of a difficult conversation. And then thirdly, sharing thought leadership and good practice. What's really been evident is that the problems and angst and challenges of businesses in one sector are pretty much the same, albeit with a slightly different flavour of those in another sector, regardless of what type of business they are. And being able to connect people either through a webinar or indeed just on a one-to-one connection, and the good practice that those different members bring has been hugely helpful for our member organisations. So ultimately, we want to make the conditions by which it becomes mainstream that businesses grasp and act on this agenda. There's no charge for joining Business Declares, by the way, although we do seek donations for things like running the website. So if you think that your organisation, your people would benefit from becoming part of it, learning and sharing, taking action, then please do contact me. Just moving forward very quickly, to become a member of Business Declares, we ask a few things: a public declaration, a clear net zero target, and some mention of scope 3, because that does tend to account for more like 90% of most people's emissions. We work with you to create a climate transition plan, and we also ask organisations that they advocate this topic and get the word out there. The next slide just gives you an example of the types of organisations that are part of Business Declares. You can see people from the energy sector, like Good Energy and Ecotricity, the legal sector, like Bates Wells, the commercial sector in terms of retail, like the Body Shop and Pucker. So we've got a whole range of different organisations, and as I say, although they're very different, actually the issues are pretty similar. And just on to the next one, here's an example of a kind of, well, this is an example of a one-pager taken from a climate transition plan that we would work with an organisation to help put together. So we'd work with an organisation on what's their commitment, what type of plans are they going to, what actions are they going to take, and what's their overall response. And that's the type of deliverable that we would work with you to produce. And finally, the last slide. This is the last one from me, and I will stop at this one. If any of what I've said resonates with you and you want to speak more just for an exploratory conversation or just to learn more, please contact me on any of those areas. So that was all I was going to cover. Happy to take questions later as they come through the chat. Thank you very much, and I'll hand back to Emma.
Well, thanks for that, Ben. If you could just keep your camera on, I'm actually going to ask you a few questions first. Thank you so much for giving such a great introduction to today's session. We'll have a bit more time for questions later, but there's a couple I'd like to ask you. Actually, just one for curiosity for me first was, how did your organisation respond when you had, said climate epiphany and came in and decided to try and make these changes?
Amazingly well, actually, and I guess I am blessed with working in an organisation that has a very open culture and a very supportive culture, and they also fully understand that for the property world, the climate and ecological breakdown is going to be a huge driver of risk as well as revenue for the sector. So to have somebody who was coming at this, I think, from a non-sustainability background was actually quite an important and interesting angle for the business, and they were, fully supportive.
Oh, that's great to hear. I then just wanted to ask, how does the case, do you think, for change stack up for local small, medium enterprises in Warrington and elsewhere that are struggling with the pandemic? How can those two things be balanced?
Yeah, it's a very difficult one because at the end of the day, businesses need to trade, people need to earn money, and if you're in, I don't know, the fossil fuel sector or whatever, you can't just shut down and everyone stays in employment. What we need to work on is a phased, just and clear transition from one thing to another, recognising that we can't do everything yesterday, but also recognising that we don't have time to wait years to do it either. So for me, this is a matter of strategy, this is a matter of program planning, and this is a matter of balancing the here and now versus the longer term future, because there won't be a future for businesses if they don't grasp this. That's a certainty. So how can we work together to plan how to do that in a phased and responsible way that doesn't see people going out of work or stopping trading? So there is a balance to be had for sure, but I think it's entirely possible with a level head and some clear thought and planning.
Great. So the last one I want to ask you before we move on to our next speaker is, for businesses who are watching the webinar today and those that are going to catch it on demand, and those that are looking to make a commitment to act on climate change, this might be difficult, but what one action would you recommend their organisation take after they've finished watching?
The one action would be to raise awareness within the employee base of the organisation, and raise awareness through perhaps training courses, perhaps providing knowledge through other forums which already exist within the business infrastructure. But raise awareness is critical, because if people don't really understand that the things that they are doing are having a hugely adverse effect, and if they don't understand the reasons for them, then it's very hard to get people to change. So raising awareness, but coupled with some practical and non-overwhelming sense of actions of what people can take. So it's kind of both of those things wrapped in one. Raise awareness with some concrete actions that people can take.
Well, and for those watching in Warrington, what exists already that they could get involved in?
For Warrington, I guess it's forums like this. It's joining local network groups. It's getting involved in as many, within reason, obviously, networks as possible that are supporting businesses and sharing problems. It's getting involved in people like Business Declares, which is non-regional. I do understand that, but it also provides a whole wealth of tools, resources, and connections. So get involved in local and maybe national groups, and derive what support you need from them.
Fantastic. And it's great to see so many organisations already signed up to Business Declares as well.
Yeah, it is.
Fantastic. So we'll move on to our next speaker. I'm really pleased to welcome our collaborators on this event, Katie Shilcock and Frances Hesketh from the Environment Partnership. Frances is the founder of TEP with 30 years experience in environmental consultancy, including employment in private, public and voluntary sectors. Katie's also a director at TEP and is the joint manager of ecology. So over the last 11 years, TEP has been on a journey to manage the company's impact on the environment. They're going to share that journey with us today, setting out their motivations for action, why they felt the responsibility to act on climate change, and the challenges and opportunities that they've encountered on their way to carbon neutrality. So if you guys are ready, I'll pass over to you.
Thanks, Emma.
Yes, well, thank you very much indeed for the welcome, and thank you, Ben, for some pretty inspiring and pretty daunting facts and figures. We wanted to share a little bit as a Birchwood-based business about our own carbon journey, and we are the Environment Partnership, so obviously we have an interest in the environment. We're an SME. We employ 140 people across the UK. We provide consultancy services in landscape design, environmental assessment, largely to the private sector, but we also work for government as well. In a sense, what I'd like to say, there's nothing magic about us, nothing special about us. We're like any SME. We have offices, we have human beings who work in our offices and drive in and drive out. By and large, we have to go to visit sites. So our journey, in a sense, can be anybody's journey, and hopefully some of the things we've taken, some of the steps we've taken may be able to be replicated by other people. The cover slide shows a little bit. On the left it's our general logo. On the right is us planting a tree in Birchwood, but in the middle are 3 of the carbon offset projects that our staff have suggested we support. So unfortunately we can't fly to these beautiful places anymore, but we can at least know that some of the work we're doing in offsetting is helping to protect those environments. So if we slip onto the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about our journey. And it's rather scary, excuse me, when you look back and you think we need to be totally net zero by 2030. And actually, you know, you look back and we started this in 2008-09, and we've still got more to do. So very briefly, here's a timeline. We'd achieved environmental management standard in 2008. 2009, we thought actually we need to move beyond this and get to carbon neutral status. As a personal thing on the board of directors, that's what we wanted to do. And our staff were also wanting to make a difference. So we engaged a consultancy called EcoAct, who have provided carbon neutrality advice. They convened a workshop at board level and helped us understand what we needed to do to achieve carbon neutrality. So we set ourselves the highest standard, which is British Standard PAS 2060, which is like the gold standard of carbon neutrality, and we achieved it in 2010 with a formulation of a 5-year carbon reduction plan, which we achieved, and we have continually achieved that. Actually, by now, we've reduced our carbon emissions, our greenhouse gas emissions, actually by 40% compared to 2010, which shows that we've done quite a lot, but we've more to do. In 2016, we enhanced the reporting that we're doing, and we refreshed our targets in 2018, and we refreshed our green team in 2020. And we're looking forwards, a couple of things. Katie is going to take on a little bit more about our future challenges, but we want to, what we're doing now is making our pension policy more ethical. We've moved to a bank which is signed the United Nations Declaration in terms of financing only environmentally sound projects. That's a bank called Handelsbanken, who are based in, well, have a branch in Warrington. And we've also found that we are now able to offer consultancy advice on carbon reduction strategies, and we're doing that to the Port Sunlight Village Heritage Trust, which manages the registered landscape in Port Sunlight on the Wirral. So we're using the lessons we've taken to actually not only reduce our own costs and our own carbon footprint, but also help others to do that journey as well. So as I kind of summarize, we did set ourselves high standards, and those measures there: measure, disclose, target, act, adjust. That's what the government advises to do. And yeah, measuring is absolutely critical, particularly if you want to be full scope. And for us, yeah, our big thing was our staff. Everybody who works in Birchwood will know it's not a brilliant place to get to. You have to drive there, more or less. Our site work involves a lot of driving. So we have a lot of emissions related to our business travel. Important to measure them, disclose them to the staff, disclose them through EcoAct, produce some targets, act and adjust. Set ourselves the highest standards, gold standard emissions reduction, gold standard offsets. And it's got to be led at the board, but it's got to have staff involvement. So that's just a kind of a summary. I'm going to hand over to Katie, who's going to talk about sort of our forward look from now on.
Thanks very much, Fran, and yes, for charting what feels like a quick journey. I guess we've moved from 2008 at rapid speed. As part of the presentation, what we've aimed to do to hopefully help others as they reflect on their journey toward carbon neutrality, wherever they may be on that journey, is think about what some of the challenges and the opportunities are. But what I started with actually was obviously doing some research both for this and just more generally, just looking at the Climate Change Committee, who published a report back in December 2020, and that was on the key role that business is going to play in achieving the UK's net zero objective. So within that, they recognise that many UK businesses are going to need to fundamentally change their operations, business models, approach to climate risk assessment and planning, and also their relationship with investors and consumers. So whilst TEP has made great steps on its journey so far, we don't underestimate the task that we think is for us to face in the future. And interestingly, this was actually backed up as well. I was looking into some research by the Carbon Trust, which confirmed that sustainable priorities will only become ever more important. And this is all recently published. So in spite of COVID, which they particularly note, that whilst obviously that is a challenge and business have faced a new challenge, one that none of us foresaw over the last 12 months, that doesn't take away the challenge that we are now going to face with regards to moving to net zero, and just how sustainability will be at the fore as more so than ever of people's thoughts and actions. So when I took a bit of a look at moving to net zero and thinking about what the opportunities and the challenges are, these were kind of what we came up with. Always want to start with opportunities, which is good to see what we can get from this. I mean, the first for us that came to my mind was actually about brand assurance. We are required to report to stakeholders on our carbon and our environmental performance, and we're seeing this ever increasing, particularly specifically in relation to our carbon reduction plan. So it was interesting what Ben had picked up on, and obviously about joining Business Declares and how that gives the opportunity to come up with the one page on adapting and addressing climate, something that we would definitely and wholeheartedly recommend that businesses look to map out what they see the challenges being and what they see their journey being. For us, it's quite a lot of our public sector work. So we will work on behalf of various local authorities and councils, local governments, and all of whom have committed to addressing the climate emergency, and therefore they're very much putting onto their supply chain, so us, a requirement to show how we are doing it. I think also just as an individual and on a personal level, we're probably all seeing increases as consumers in sustainability taking a role in decision making and purchasing power. Don't know if anyone's aware, but there's apps out there such as Capture or Almond, which allow you to track carbon. It's been described as the Strava for carbon, I saw. So yes, these are things that personally I know of my friends have got, and people are increasingly looking at how they can select brands that are committed to reducing their carbon footprint and moving towards net zero. There is also our accreditations. Fran touched on PAS 2060, which is the carbon neutrality standard that TEP has achieved. Now, I would say, obviously, with our work with Carbon Clear, that's probably the Eco Act, previously Carbon Clear. That is the gold standard of where we've looked at our accreditation so far. But our more standard approach, so our ISO 14001, which a lot of companies will be required to have, now also incorporates climate change, the requirement to ensure that it's being considered and what the environmental conditions are considered, and that environmental management systems have been adapted to address these. So therefore, I would say to businesses, no matter where you are on that journey, if it not being that it's going for full accreditation at this stage, there's very much still benefits out there to charting your carbon journey in order to assist with other accreditations. And this also then just further buys into the brand assurance that I touched on. Obviously, it gives that element of transparency to stakeholders and allows you to use verification methods to show how you have achieved or are moving towards carbon considerations. Obviously, there's access to sustainable finance as well. Now, the UK is committed as a joint signatory on the joint statement for the International Platform of Sustainable Finance to ensure that finance is considered as sustainable, and there are initiatives out there, and I think it is being recognised that green investment and financing is going to be a requirement going forward. So the more that businesses can do to be part of that journey and an early adopter or a current adopter of moving towards net zero, then the more benefit I think they will be able to recoup, both in reporting on how they invest sustainably, and also seeing what funding is likely to be available. There's things such as the National Infrastructure Bank, and also there's funding available for companies as they move to a net zero journey as well. And so that's something we would encourage others to look at opportunities and see how they could further explore that. And then finally, I've just pulled on quickly here on risk management. So at board level, there is increasing call for sustainability and risks to be addressed, showing how sustainability is incorporated into business practices and consideration of the adverse impacts of their processes and how they are being addressed and mitigated for. And risk management, it's an important element of all business management, I would say. And so one of the things that we're looking at in TEP is how we can demonstrate the governance at board level. As Fran says, it's very much, there is a commitment to carbon neutrality, looking at net zero from board level at TEP, but kind of how we can better embed those risk management into our governance and risk management processes, looking at modelling that we can undertake to manage the impacts of climate, both today and then as we transition to the requirement for net zero, and to look at then improving transparency, both internally within the staff, but also externally to stakeholders. And I think any element of risk management for me, and Ben touched on that, I think, saying that we're at this time where we can look at innovation. And so hopefully through effective risk management in the climate emergency and modelling, we can help ourselves in identifying where those innovative techniques may be that we can look to employ as a company now and in the future. So I think there's a lot of opportunities out there as we look to move towards net zero. I think it's important that we grab onto those. But obviously there are the challenges as well. And I mean, the first two I've put on there are time and cost. As an organisation, this hasn't been necessary. It's not always an easy journey, you know, and it has required significant time in particular, and also costs for us as an organisation. Now, I would say, I think as we have started the journey and then we move along it, that time in particular reduces, and we've got a fantastic, Fran just mentioned the green team, we've got a team in the company, you know, so at every level across every office and within every skill team, we have a member that sits on that. So they very much help us with kind of data capture and reporting against our systems and reporting back on how we are performing in regards to carbon. But it would be remiss of me to say that it isn't a challenge, and it's something that we need to balance alongside the other aspects of the business. Changing behaviours is probably the one that I wanted to touch on just in a slightly bit more detail. I think time and cost, we all know that it does cost that. And so it's for businesses as part of their risk management to see about how they can start their journey and where they can see it going to when. Changing behaviours is something that, yeah, I think for us is something I want to look at us focusing on over the coming years. TEP is an environmental consultancy, so the staffing very much does come from a broad base of being environmentally aware, conscious, and in a lot of instances very passionate about sustainability in the environment. But we still see resistance to perhaps changing some behaviours. So for example, you know, we use hire cars, which are all low emission vehicles, or they could be electric vehicles. Some staff, for example, may think, no, do you know what, I'll just use my own car instead. I would prefer that, even though I know that, you know, I'm not getting the benefit of not using my vehicle. So it's why, what are the barriers to those people in adopting the strategies that we put in place that are out there for them? And I think by better understanding the obstacles are as to why people don't change their behaviours, the better chance we've got of changing them. I think what we're keen to avoid is kind of just providing people with reams of literature on why it's good to be sustainable I think now I come from a view place that our staff know that, and our stakeholders know that, but it's why aren't we changing? If we're not seeing a change in behaviours, why? And what can we do to change that? And so I don't underestimate the task that lies ahead. And then finally, it's just balancing trade-offs. So, like I've said, there are always going to be competing demands within the business, and carbon is very important to us, but we have lots of other priorities, not least financial, having a well-run business, but also, you know, we are very socially minded as well, and we look to see where there's common themes and these things can overlap and have benefits, but there will be times when we have to promote or choose to adopt one initiative over another. And so it's just making sure that we've got a clear decision-making process in place for that. So that probably gives a bit of a whistle-stop tour as to how TEP has been on their carbon journey, what we think the opportunities and challenges are, and then for us going forward, where we see about focusing our efforts. So I hope everybody's found that useful, and I'll hand back to Emma now, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you so much, Katie and Francis, for that presentation. It's really amazing actually to see how much TEP's achieved so far. And I think it's really worth saying that for any businesses local to Birchwood, or any businesses that aren't in Birchwood or Warrington, and who would be interested in learning more about TEP's carbon neutral journey, then you guys would certainly be pleased to hear from anyone. Great. So I've got a couple of questions before we move on to our next speaker. You talked a little bit about some of the challenges that you faced as an organisation in pursuing your carbon neutral journey. As you're now looking towards achieving net zero, do you think that will present new challenges? And if so, how do you plan to overcome them?
Yes,
Yeah.
Sorry, that's it. You've got two of us. It's yeah, it's who's going to speak first. But yes, I think for us, the challenges, like I said, it's about meaningful engagement with our staff, and how can we meaningfully do that? How can we empower them to think about how we're going to move to that next step? They are all committed on the whole, I think, to sustainability and appreciate what we have done. And I also think this is an opportunity for us because, like Ben said about retention of staff, and people are more increasingly wanting to see this, but I'm quite keen to see how we can further strengthen the great work that our green team have done to engage more broadly and look at what initiatives we can put in place. I don't know, Fran, if you had anything to add.
No, I think you're right there, Katie. It's keeping and learning from the staff's own engagement and keeping them highly motivated. That's the biggest thing for us.
Yeah, that's great. So another question, slightly different. You became fully carbon neutral as an organisation in 2010, and that was through a combination, as we saw from your slide, of driving down carbon footprint, but also offsetting those carbon emissions that are unavoidable. Do you think that offsetting is always an acceptable way for businesses, and are there an acceptable strategy, and are there limits to how you can use that strategy as you pursue net zero?
Yeah, it's a thorny one, that really. Offsetting does feel like carrying on eating cream eggs through Lent because somebody else has given up. But yeah, you do, unfortunately, as a business, you know, people do still drive fossil fuel powered cars to work, and we have sites that are quite a long way from our offices. Not everybody can afford an electric car, so for us, that thing, we are inevitably going to have a carbon footprint no matter what we do in the next 5 years. So yeah, we're trying to encourage our staff to move to hybrid cars or electric cars with interest-free loans and such like that. But so we are going to need to use offsets, I'm afraid. So what we need to try and do is look at the standard of the offsets. The ones we've chosen so far have been gold standard and have also fulfilled other sustainable development goals. So our staff vote on the offsets, and previously they voted for smoke reduction ovens in Darfur, which have a great benefit for women's lives. So they do deliver other sustainable development goals, but we also do need to look at sequestration offsets that actually permanently take carbon out of the atmosphere. So yes, we're stuck with offsetting, and we've got to improve what we do with them.
Yeah. No, it is a difficult one, and it's really great that your staff's involved in, you know, how the organisation does offset those carbon emissions. So, cool. I'm going to quickly move on to our next speaker. So thank you both. I'm really pleased to welcome our final speaker this morning, Signe Norberg. Signe is the Head of Public Affairs and Communications at the Aldersgate Group. And the Aldersgate Group is a multi-stakeholder alliance championing a competitive and environmental sustainable economy. She's kindly joined us this morning to address the question, the very big question, what policies are required for businesses to achieve net zero? So just to make sure you get all your time, Signe, I'll pass over to you now.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I'm just going to bring up my slides. There we go. Hopefully you can all see that. So yes, I have a big topic to cover today, but I will do my best to go through this as succinctly as possible, and it won't be possible for me to cover all the different areas here today, but I'm happy to take up specific questions in the questions afterwards if that's helpful. But what I will focus on today is really what role does government have to put in place policies that will make it easier for businesses across the economy to reach net zero. And I think a good place to start with this from the beginning is just that we need to recognize that we're now at a time of quite fundamental change. The pandemic has changed the way that we do business and had a significant impact across the country. So as part of kind of the Building Back Greener ambition that the government has and the kind of 10-point plan that the Prime Minister set out, we need to recognize that now is the chance to incorporate climate and environmental goals as we recover from the pandemic. And the reason why this is so important is essentially that it helps address a lot of the concerns that come from the pandemic and how we recover sustainably. And drawing on research that we commissioned from the London School of Economics back in July last year, we can really see the value of having climate and environment integrated into our recovery, because it really helps address immediate concerns around unemployment, sluggish growth in the economy, and address regional inequality. And the reason why this is the case is because often investment in areas such as energy efficiency, offshore wind, electric vehicles, they tend to be quite job intensive, especially at the current stage which those areas are at. And that creates a lot of jobs. And similarly to industrial clusters, they tend to be regionally spread out across the UK, which means that we can really make sure that these opportunities reach all corners of the UK. But in a more long-term perspective as well, there is an increased recognition, as was mentioned earlier, that we need more resilience in our economy and in our sort of societal day-to-day. And incorporating this helps build that resilience further, particularly as the impacts of climate change become more apparent. It will be important to have increased investment in low carbon infrastructure, nature restoration, because they help alleviate those impacts as well as build that long-term resilience that we seek. And whilst I'm kind of now talking a lot about public investment, it's very important to recognize that it's not just all about the public purse. There's a significant role here for businesses, but also a mixture of measures as well, that whilst we need some investment in some areas, there's a clear role here for putting in place policies that will help facilitate private sector finance and open up new markets. So I will kind of touch on that mixture as I go through the presentation today, but very much informed with the understanding that businesses have a crucial role here to play as well, and should be very much part of the national discussion as well. And the way I would kind of categorize the areas of action that we need in order to build back greener or incorporate climate and environment into our recovery is to look at this through essentially two categories. One is accelerating so-called low regret options, where we know what the solutions are and it's a matter of building on progress that's already in place, as well as addressing hard to treat sectors where there's often quite high energy use and significant amounts of emissions where they need to come down, but we don't know yet what the solutions are. And both of these areas need to be addressed as the government sets forward their net zero strategy later this year. So both of these areas need to be considered. Starting with the low regret actions, these are, as I've said, areas where we know what the solutions are, but it's a matter of putting in place further policies that can accelerate this transition. And it will be a mixture of regulation and fiscal incentives to ramp up action. I can mention some of those areas as well, and that includes energy efficiency in buildings, private as well as commercial. It's introducing more options for low carbon heat in buildings, rolling out electric vehicles, building a more robust public transport system, as well as decarbonizing the power sector. And doing these things essentially provide us with that credible foundation upon which further action can then kind of propel us up towards where we need to get to for reaching net zero by 2050. So these are really the areas where we need immediate action. However, on the other side of the coin, we then have the hard to treat sectors where it needs to be much more focused rather than kind of fiscal and regulatory incentives. We need a very ambitious innovation agenda to look at the technologies of the future and how we can get large scale trials of crucial technologies such as carbon capture and storage and hydrogen, as well as new land management schemes in agriculture and so forth, because really by looking at it through that innovation lens, we can help drive down further emissions in these sectors. But it will need to be a little bit learning by doing in this area because the answers are not immediately clear. Similarly, there needs to be a lot of coordination and collaboration with other actors in this space. It will not just be the role for the UK alone. It needs to work with other institutions and international actors in these crucial areas to learn from technology developments across the globe and how digital innovation and these technologies can work together to reduce emissions in these sectors. And finally, before I give you some practical examples of what those policies look like, it's worth noting that there are additional policies to help open up new markets and new products and services for businesses that the government need to seriously consider. And part of that is looking at where we need to drive further progress, but what policies really help facilitate that. And the example I've used on the slide here is the potential role for product standards to drive down embedded carbon in, for example, buildings materials such as steel or cement. But public procurement is also a very powerful lever to help grow the demand for these technologies as well, because it will need to be a dual thing about supply and demand. But initially, it's the case of driving up demand for government where we need to see them take on an active role. And just going back in terms of what the specific policies are in these areas, I've included some examples on the slide here. I think that it's worth saying that the power sector, for example, has already done a lot of work in terms of reducing their emissions. We've seen growth in renewable energy sources, and that really needs to continue. We also need to look at mechanisms such as the contract for difference auctions, which is how we can sort of set prices for renewable sources. We need to look at that being sufficiently ambitious and making sure that they continue to drive further developments in that sector. Additionally, we now have an emissions trading scheme as the UK, and we need to have further certainty from government around the carbon pricing mechanism, and that there is a carbon price escalator that will help reduce emissions in a range of sectors, and that it somehow links back to the EU scheme as well to be as effective as possible. In the transport sector, we have had quite ambitious commitments from government in terms of the phase out of sales of new diesel, petrol and hybrid cars and vehicles. But we now need to build on this very ambitious commitment to have a robust charging infrastructure in place, and that there are incentives in place to help facilitate that transition towards green cars. Because as the previous speakers mentioned, not everyone can afford an electric vehicle currently. So it's about making and helping make the right choice in the future when the time comes. But similarly, there also needs to be an integrated transport strategy. So looking beyond personal vehicles and looking at how does that interact with trains and with buses, and how do we make sure that we have a transport system in the UK that is low emissions and integrate and speak to each other. And the issue of mobility is quite crucial in this area. In the waste sector, there are commitments around extended producer responsibility scheme and deposit return schemes. These are really welcomed, but we need to see those being rolled out across the UK to help further incentivize progress in the waste and resources sector. Having said that, however, there are some crucial lessons here in terms of resource efficiency from waste and resources that should be scaled up across the economy, because it's a key enabler in how other industries can help decarbonize, is by using the resources that they utilize in a better way, and where possible, reuse or repair rather than throw away. So there's some key lessons there that can be scaled up for sure. And then looking at the built environment, here there's a crucial role to set in place an energy efficiency standard, a minimum floor by which there should be a certain level of efficiency in new and existing buildings. And building on that, there needs to be an extension to the Green Homes Grant and further actions to essentially take up that scheme. Quickly running through some of the hard to treat sectors as well. There are a key role here for looking at aviation and shipping and what path they need to be put on to reduce their emissions. And there's a lot of work going on at this place, in this space, to essentially facilitate this. But what government should look to do is to encourage the formal inclusion of shipping and aviation's emissions in our carbon budgets. This will not only send a clear market signal, but it will also help facilitate a greater awareness of where measures and efficiencies can be made. I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to quickly go through some of the other areas as well. But for example, the upcoming hydrogen strategy will be crucial, not just for industry, but for a range of sectors, and how that technology can help reduce emissions. In agriculture, there will be a crucial issue of how we link up with a lot of developments in this space to help not only with nature restoration, but also help farmers, make a living and have increased efficiencies in that space. Now, before I wrap up, I wanted to quickly touch on the issue of skills as well, because we can't talk about the transition to net zero and businesses and what needs to happen at a national level without addressing the need to make sure that we bring people along on this journey. And some things that we've called for as the Aldersgate Group is a national low carbon skills strategy, where sustainability needs to be embedded across the education system and lifelong learning to help make sure that there is an increased understanding of what low carbon economy looks like and what the requirements will be and what skills are needed. Similarly, apprenticeship standards and new qualifications will be needed to make sure that we have those certifications and pipeline of future talent that can really equip themselves with those necessary skills for the future. Finally, I just want to quickly mention that we also need to make sure that low carbon investment is directed towards regions that have been significantly impacted by the pandemic, and that there are transferable skill sets in those regions that we should really look to harness as we map out our net zero future, and that there's a crucial role here for local authorities to be involved in maximizing local growth and job creation in their areas. I will literally only touch on this very briefly, but there's also a role for how government can facilitate the kind of finance industry and how finance institutions can help support businesses in their decarbonisation journey. And part of that is making sure that there are climate disclosures that have already been mentioned, but also that the recently announced National Infrastructure Bank has climate and environment really at the heart of its agenda. And then for trade, it's really about making sure that we consider climate and environment through our emerging trade policy, and that we protect our right to regulate with imports so that we do not have unintended consequences with the services and goods that we import from other countries as well, and maintain a very high competitive low carbon economy in the UK. So I appreciate this is a very whistle-stop tour, but if you want to find out more, I highly recommend having a look at our report, Building a Net Zero Emissions Economy, which is available on our website, and very happy to take any questions that you might have. So thank you so much. Oh goodness, I can't hear you, Emma. I'm so sorry. Hold on. Emma, can you hear me? Oh, I can't hear you for some reason.
Emma, you've got the crackle. Change your mic input, maybe.
Is that better?
Yes.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Signe, for that very comprehensive overview in a very short period of time. I really appreciate how much you got in. And we can certainly share the resource with the registrants from this event after we've finished here. So I'm going to take a question from the chat actually for you to begin with. Jeff has asked, in view of the science represented by people like Attenborough in his recent speech to the UN, do you see the role for business to push government towards a much more ambitious target than net zero by 2050?
I think that's an excellent question. So thank you so much for that. I think that it's a very important role for businesses to actually make sure that there is a clear business voice for how this is, makes financial sense, it makes economic sense, and that we really embed this agenda going forward across the economy, because that's what's really going to help us reach our net zero ambitions. And I think that from progressive businesses, there is a recognition that they should go there sooner than 2050. But I think that what I was trying to illustrate is that that picture will vary across a range of industries. So, but I would fully agree that there needs to be an active business voice, and the more businesses can really support this agenda, the better. Brilliant. And that maps on really well to obviously what Ben was talking about in his first presentation as well. So David's asked a question. The circular economy is going to be very important in driving net zero. How can we stimulate this emerging sector locally? That is also a very good question. It's something that I personally feel very strongly about. I've actually got a local authority background, so did a lot on waste and resources through that as well. And I think that in terms of how that can be stimulated locally, I think that actually local businesses are so important, because even in terms of the sort of day-to-day in terms of recycling, that's something where there needs to be further action at local level. But I think that similarly, looking at how businesses can employ some of these more innovative technologies and ask the question of, can I reuse, repair any of the materials, or recycle any of the materials that we go through as a business, and how can I incorporate that through the kind of business life cycle? And I think that's something that will be very important. So innovate and look at how you can do things differently at a local level is also very important.
Real. Cool. So I just wanted to ask you a question off the back of your presentation. How can places like Warrington build back greener and still achieve a positive impact on the economy, employment, and regional equality? Just taking it to that more local level.
Yeah, a big question as well. I think a very important first step is understanding what has the impact been and what are the requirements for the local area? What are the skills that you already have in place in the industries that you have? What role do they play? Understanding that local picture will be so important because that gives you that bedrock on which you can build. And I think that part of that needs to be engaging with businesses so they understand the role that they can play. But also I think there's a clear role here for also local MPs to really vocalize what your local area needs to the national level as well. So government understands what an area will really need in this transition, because that local to national dialogue will be ever so important as we continue towards 2050.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Signe. And that feels like a really nice point to move on to our final speaker, Charlotte Nichols. So let me just pull up my notes. I'd now like to hand over to Charlotte, who's kindly joined us at today's event to share her thoughts and reflections on today's theme. Charlotte's been a Member of Parliament for Warrington North since December 2019. She also sits on the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Committee, a select committee that examines and scrutinises the expenditure, administration and policy of the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and that includes the Committee on Climate Change. So Charlotte, we've heard from speakers on the risks climate change poses to business, the opportunities that there are in acting on the threat and acting early. And then we've also heard about the realities of actually putting those changes into place in the workplace. And as you'll have heard from Signe, the support that businesses need from government and at the local level now and in the future. So I'd now like to invite you to speak and talk to us in your capacity as a local MP and a chair on the BEIS committee about the role that businesses have to play in reaching the government's net zero target. And also discuss the support that will be required for businesses to achieve these ambitions at a national and local level, particularly within your constituency and in the north of England more broadly. So I'll pass over to you now if you're ready.
Hello everyone, and thank you for having me this morning. It's great to be here. As has just been said, I'm a member of the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Select Committee, but alongside that in Parliament, I'm also the Vice Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Nuclear and an Officer of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Hydrogen. There was a really interesting report that came out today actually from the Centre for Towns about the fact that a majority of so-called red wall voters really support green policies. And I think that's something that's not really a surprise to anyone that's been paying attention, because that was something that was actually the cornerstone of my election manifesto and all the materials that I put out locally, because the Northwest in particular, but also the Northeast, really stands to benefit from a properly managed green industrial revolution and a green industrial strategy. The problem from my point of view as someone who was a trade union officer before coming into Parliament, who represented energy workers, was the fact that there is a stated aspiration in terms of our policy of decarbonisation, but actually it hasn't really had a very considered roadmap for how to get there put in place. And I think that's something that I'm hoping that our presidency of COP26 this year will help to address. But clearly these are things which don't happen by accident. It's businesses, unions, and all the various sectors coming together and having that engagement and dialogue with government to make sure that the policies that are put in place are both something that's achievable, but also something that is actually going to deliver that outcome. Now, one of the things I've often been concerned about is the fact that despite the massive increase in the energy mix, in the number of renewables within that mix, the number of green jobs in the UK, according to the ONS, has actually reduced over the last 10 years by about 40,000. So it's clear that just pursuing green agenda in and of itself won't necessarily deliver jobs. Now, part of this is to do with issues around procurement, particularly in sectors like offshore wind, where typically these are, manufactured in places like the Netherlands, in Korea, and shipped over here, and have a much smaller employment multiplier than, for example, things like nuclear, which locally in Warrington, with the thousands of people that work in really sort of well-paid, skilled, unionised jobs in civil nuclear, we know how important that sector is going forward. And I think that Warrington as a town is really well located strategically to benefit from the hydrogen development that's happening across the region, including in hydrogen trains next door in Holton, but also in hydrogen for heating as well. But one of the things that hasn't really been there in the government strategy so far is joining up nuclear and hydrogen. I find that, unfortunately, and I think this is as much the fault of business as it is of government, everyone seems to sort of be fighting over the pie that is the energy mix, rather than having a really coordinated approach across the energy industries. I think I've also personally been concerned that there is an assumption from the public that just because a company is doing a green good, that they are sort of otherwise a moral company. And I think we've seen from things recently, with some of the new players in the green sector, that they're not necessarily employing people on terms and conditions that are equivalent with more established parts of the energy sector. They're approaching energy in the same way as sort of disruptors in other industries, whether it's your Ubers in the transport sector, your Airbnb in hospitality, and so on. And I think that's something that's a real concern to me, because I think that one of the things that we need to do, particularly when it comes to the skills agenda and to getting these things into schools, making sure that we've got the right qualifications locally for people to be pursuing careers in, decarbonising our economy, there needs to be an actual career for them to go into, secure jobs, proper progression pathways, and so on. So I think that's something that I'm really working on with the committee at the moment. We've got an inquiry on the Base Select Committee on green growth sort of post-COVID, because I think that the current economic landscape is obviously quite concerning, and you can go one of two ways, I suppose, in following the government's kind of austerity agenda of the last 10 years or so to try and rebalance the books, which I think would be fatal for our country, or to go the other route, which is to invest in growth, to develop sectors where we can be global leaders. Hydrogen's a really great example of this, and to really make sure that the economic benefits of a green recovery are spread throughout the country. As I said, Warrington's in a great place to benefit not only from what's happening locally in hydrogen and in nuclear, but also developments that are happening with the Mersey Bay tidal lagoon, for example. The amount of people that we've got locally who are suitably skilled to be able to participate in that. We've got the tidal project at Woolston Weir as well, which I think will be great once that's sort of up and running. And I think it's a really exciting time for us, but it's making sure that we harness that potential, making sure that all of the businesses who have got an interest, whether it's directly or as part of the supply chain in this, are working together, are speaking with one voice, lobbying the government as much as possible to make sure that we're really driving that. I kind of don't want to talk at you for too long, because I'm much more interested in hearing what you guys have got to say and sort of generating a bit of a discussion. But I suppose there's some sort of starting thoughts from me. I'm happy to pick up on any questions that anyone's got, or ideas for how we can drive this agenda forward together.
That's great. Thank you so much, Charlotte, for that kind of overview and introduction. I want to start with a question in respect of bringing businesses to the table to discuss climate change and your membership of the committee. How would you like to see the government do that differently or more effectively as a result of, you being on that board, on that committee?
Well, one of the things that I'm looking to set up at the moment is a series of sort of roundtable discussions with businesses, because I engage with sort of individual businesses throughout the year, particularly when they've got projects coming up or bits of legislation that they've got a particular interest in, whether it affects them sort of positively or negatively. But the problem, I suppose, for all of us has been over the last year, how you can do that engagement and outreach. And I think the fact that we're all really au fait with using technologies like Zoom and Teams and so on now means, from my point of view, it's actually a lot easier to get businesses and groups together to have those sorts of conversations than perhaps it has been previously, where you're sort of trying to manage everyone's diaries and it's a bit like herding cats. So I mean, personally, as a local constituency MP and as a member of the select committee, that's something that I'm looking to do. But I think it's also about businesses sort of being quite proactive. There are a number of bills throughout the year, a number of sort of white papers, whether it's the energy white paper, whether it's the inquiry that the committee is running at the moment, that they're always looking for people who have actually got an expertise in these things, who do it day in, day out, to put in their assessment of the situation or their ideas, because otherwise I think they're very skewed towards a kind of radical green lobby who are very idealistic. They kind of want the same things, but sometimes their ideas about how to get there on a practical level are either overly ambitious, particularly when it comes to the fact that the technologies for things like carbon capture and storage and battery technology, for example, aren't as well developed as some people would have you think. From my point of view, we definitely need at least another generation of nuclear power stations, for example, to bridge that gap, because we're just not there yet on those things, or perhaps being overly ambitious about the scalability of certain technologies as well. It really needs people who work in the industry, who do that day in, day out, to have something that's credible, because it's one thing government coming up with, some great ideas and a piece of paper, but if it's not something that's deliverable, it's just a waste of absolutely everyone's time.
Yeah. No, I think we'll pick up on what you said about bills and cross-party working and how people can get involved that way in the Q&A with Laura. But I'm just going to ask you one more question before we move on to that. So in Warrington, your constituency, Warrington North, like many places in the UK, you have a lot of very deprived neighbourhoods. I wondered if you were convinced that we can balance reducing that deprivation at the same time as achieving net zero.
I think that it's actually a really fundamental part of it. So in Warrington, we kind of have a bit of a tale of two towns, because you have the retail distribution sector, which is actually a bigger part of our local economy than the private sector, which is dominated by, precarious work, 0 hours contracts, pay at or around the national minimum wage, generally very poor working conditions in a lot of sort of the big warehouse spaces. And then you also have, in the nuclear sector in particular, really high quality science and engineering jobs, things that require sort of master's level qualifications sometimes just to get your foot in the door. The amount of nuclear physicists that we've got knocking around Birchwood is really quite impressive. And the problem is that it's very much those two things sector-wise. Now, from my point of view, the more that we have investment in sectors like nuclear locally, it is a growth sector. I think we've had about 700 more jobs this year in civil nuclear in Warrington than there were in the previous year. And clearly with things like Sizewell C potentially, you know, coming on stream, that will be even more work that's available locally. There is a multiplier effect to that, which benefits everyone, which is, you know, you have people who are in higher paid jobs, who've got more disposable income, who are more able to be spending money in, you know, the bars, the restaurants, the shops in town. You know, that money circulates around our local economy and benefits people who, you know, are perhaps in lower paid work, you know, because it supports the growth and development of, you know, sectors, particularly when it comes to things like culture, leisure and retail. But I think that there's the bigger piece about what it means for the town as well. You know, it's somewhere that the more vibrant our local economy is, the more people will want to move to Warrington, which boosts things like, you know, council tax yield, for example, which again means that for the people that are falling behind for whatever reason, that we're as a town better able to support them. And I think when we look at the sort of corporate social responsibility stuff that a lot of the big employers locally do, again, that's very much determined by their continued success. So Sellafield, for example, you know, they contribute to the Fernhead Pantry, which is a kind of follow-on scheme from the food banks. So obviously the food banks for emergency support, but the food pantry, the idea is that it kind of gets people back on their feet and kind of transitions them into, you know, not needing that support anymore. That's something that there is money from the local council to deliver, but it's also very much supported by local businesses. And so I think their continued success, their growth, you know, benefits not just those businesses and the people that work for them directly, but actually our whole town.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. We're now going to move into a Q&A with all the speakers. I want to thank all of our speakers and Charlotte for joining us on their fantastic presentations. We've had a few questions in advance of the event, and there's a couple that popped up in the chat. So if the other speakers you'd like to turn your videos on, and Laura will chair this next bit.
Thank you, Emma. And yeah, we've got a bit of time for Q&A. I'll direct questions to individuals, but if there's anything you want to add, please do just pop your hand up and we can make it a bit more of a discussion as well. So Ben, this first one's for you, if that's okay. So this one is, how can we more effectively engage SMEs in this discussion? So we know that similar events like this one have been run in Warrington quite recently by organisations such as the Birchwood Forum, but interest seems to be quite low, and to be honest, interest was quite low for this event too. So we're really interested in what you think is needed to bring those businesses into the conversation and encourage them to commit to climate action.
Yeah, I think it goes back to what I was saying a bit earlier about the need to raise awareness, but also couple that with practical actions. Because if people don't really understand the level of catastrophe that we are facing, then they maybe think this is for another day and it's kind of an add-on to the to-do list, when actually every single business policy needs to be viewed through the lens of the climate and ecological breakdown. It is that important. But I don't think people fully grasp that, and partly, you know, there's insufficient media coverage, you know, partly things like the CE bill are not fully supported very widely, and therefore there's not the sort of huge drive to the level that I think it should be. So I think awareness raising and a campaign, a local campaign, would be the answer. But it's not just about raising awareness, it is actually about coming up with concrete actions, and certainly dealing with the, you know, dichotomous question of getting to net zero without causing mass unemployment, you know, having a green transition and all of that lot. Those thorny questions need to be answered alongside the practical things, like some of the things that I talked about in my presentation around encouraging employees to switch to green electricity, etc. So I think for me, it's a campaign focused on awareness raising and dealing with difficult, thorny issues, coupled with practical actions that needs to be run on a local level.
Thanks, Ben. And Charlotte, I imagine you speak to lots of local businesses. Do you have any thoughts on that in terms of bringing more businesses into the conversation on climate action locally?
I think engagement is always tricky, particularly at the moment where everyone's got sort of a bit of Zoom fatigue. So perhaps sort of as we start to move towards the summer and things start to, you know, improve generally, you might see a greater uptake, just because, you know, perhaps these sorts of discussions will feel like a novelty again for a lot of people, which is certainly my hope. I think it's very much about having specific actions as well, because sometimes these things can feel, certainly not this event, but can feel like a bit of a talking shop where everyone identifies the problems, but perhaps not the solutions, or there's no action points to take forward from them. And of course, you know, many businesses will find that they're in broad agreement with each other on what needs to be done. The issue is more that some of them are either reticent to do it if their competitors aren't, because they worry that they'll lose their competitive edge as a result of investment in, you know, becoming greener, or because, you know, they're not getting the support that they need to do that from the government. And, you know, I've mentioned hydrogen previously, but, you know, one of the things that I constantly hear back from businesses there is that it's a bit of a chicken and an egg sector at the moment, where there are all of these things that are kind of ready to happen, but they all kind of need the other things to happen. And it's a bit like, well, you know, we know that there are a lot of projects about sort of hydrogen trains, for example, you know, hydrogen buses locally, all these sorts of things, but what they need is a lot of hydrogen to do that. And so they need hydrogen development projects to start or come online elsewhere. And then those projects are saying, well, you know, we need people to want to use the hydrogen that we're producing in order to bother producing it, because otherwise we've just got loads of hydrogen for, you know, don't need it for anything. And I think that's an issue, not just of coordination between those businesses to be able to put in things like, you know, sort of combined business cases to government, but also sometimes the lack of, you know, in that sector as an example, there's no body that has kind of overall responsibility for coordination in the hydrogen sector, for example. You know, you have various authorities that are kind of sector level organisations within nuclear, sector level organisations within gas generally, but, you know, there's a gap there, I think, in some places for businesses to be able to come together. And whether it's that the government just needs to set it up and everyone will join it, or whether the businesses need to join it and set it up and then say to government, you know, listen to us, we're the experts in this field. You know, I'm not 100% sure, but I mean, certainly we can't continue as we are at the moment.
Thanks, Charlotte. And Signe and Charlotte, I think this one's for you as well, but maybe Signe can go first. What do you think is the best way that the government can support SMEs in constituencies like Warrington North to join the race to net zero?
Very good question. I think that I will maybe start with, I think that it's often felt like sort of committing to net zero is sort of a large business undertaking. And I think that they often have the profit margins often to kind of start doing things. And speaking to colleagues who work closely with SMEs, there is a little bit of I think an education piece first and foremost, so that they understand what their role is and how they can sort of be part of the net zero transition, just in terms of providing them with the information. But similarly, I think that there needs to be further targeted support for SMEs so that they can take the steps that they can, but also then have that further support from government and potentially larger businesses that they operate with to together put them on a trajectory towards net zero, because there's often a lot that goes into running an SME, and they will need sort of targeted support to kind of be part of this journey. At a local level, I think that's where sort of local authorities and local partnerships play an important part in terms of connecting them to others in the community, and how you can help grow a low carbon supply chain within the local area and potentially scale up business action through those kind of partnerships.
Thanks, Signe. And Charlotte, do you have any other thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think there's a role for some of the bigger businesses locally. I'm thinking particularly of companies like IKEA, who've obviously got their sort of flagship store in Warrington North, where it's not only carbon neutral, it's like sort of one step beyond that. I've gone brain dead for what the term for that is, but where it's, you know, it's a net benefit as opposed to carbon negative, maybe. But, you know, to sort of show other businesses what works, because a lot of this is about best practice. Small and medium-sized businesses don't necessarily have the resources to be able to be trying out various bits and pieces that may or may not work. So having sort of established best practice elsewhere that they can follow is really helpful. I think going back to the sort of procurement piece that I said earlier as well, I'm very interested in what we can kind of do to keep Warrington's money circulating in Warrington, essentially, so the money that's invested in sort of growing our green economy locally is spent, you know, 5, 6, 7 times before it leaves the town. And I think one of the ways to do this is through sort of the business exchange in particular. I'm having quite a lot of discussions with Warrington & Co about how they can make it easier for businesses to procure within Warrington for those sorts of things. So, you know, we have companies locally that manufacture all sorts of things. For example, like, you know, I found out recently that all of the sort of seat covers and things and like the tunnels and stuff at Wimbledon are made in Warrington North. They're made in Woolston. And, you know, they do a lot of sort of quite heavy textiles manufacturing. They make the decontamination gowns at Sellafield and all of these sorts of things. But most people wouldn't even know that they were there. So they might have products that they could be supplying other companies locally that would help them in that. But the other companies don't know that they're there. So the easier that you make it for all of the companies that we do have in that green supply chain to be working with other companies, to be getting business from other businesses in Warrington, and as I said, sort of keeping that money circulating around the town, it means that we can all, as a sort of local community, be supporting each other, not only in decarbonising, but in making sure that, as has been said previously, that it's not a kind of trade-off between you know, sort of doing a green good for our town and doing an economic good for our town, because I don't think that there has to be a distinction between those two things if that process is kind of managed properly with a proper strategy behind it.
Fantastic, thanks. And obviously Katie and Fran from the Environment Partnership, you are actually based in Charlotte's constituency in Birchwood. So on that subject of government support for SMEs, and you have gone a long way in terms of your carbon neutral journey already, but is there anything with Charlotte here that as an SME you would like to highlight in terms of support that you would need for your next step of the journey?
Yeah, thanks Laura, and thanks very much Charlotte for coming along today. Yeah, I think, I mean, I don't want to ask too much of government really, because they've got a lot of other things on their plate. We've chosen to do it because we wanted personally to be carbon neutral. It was a personal mission. I think business support generally, in kind of the general sort of business link, business support the councils can offer is always good. A sort of a mentoring, hand-holding support. I guess one thing I would like to have seen is recognition in the procurement, public procurement supply chain side of things, that if you do have accreditations in respect of carbon neutrality, that you should get some credit for that, because we bid for a lot of public sector contracts, and being carbon neutral, quite frankly, doesn't get us any further than a very fossil fuel hungry business does. So it would be nice just to see a little bit more recognition in the way government procures contracts for businesses that do go the extra mile environmentally.
I am hoping that as a kind of, you know, silver lining potentially to come out of Brexit, that the procurement rules that are all part of the sort of GPA, which the government has always said is the reason why, you know, it's forced to procure from overseas, you know, because all the EU state aid rules mean that, you know, if they do it cheaper, we've got to get it from them and all that sort of stuff, which I mean, I'm never convinced by anyway. But certainly they're not able to use that excuse anymore. And I think now we've come to the end of the transition period, sort of working with colleagues in Parliament to do everything I can around that procurement piece, because I think that's the bit of the puzzle that's been missing for a really long time.
Yes, that'd be helpful. Thank you.
Great, thank you all. Ben, just coming to you again, if that's okay. You mentioned, and actually both Katie and Francis also discussed, the multiple benefits of an organisation in becoming carbon neutral. I just wondered how taking these actions and the commitment to act on climate change has affected your relationship with clients, new clients and existing clients, and importantly, impacting your success in securing new clients. So have you seen any of that success?
Yeah, it's been massive. So our clients are demanding a whole load of things, not just in things like the diversity and inclusion agenda and that aspect, but they are also demanding sustainability related aspects. So for example, occupiers of our buildings want to know that their building is as low energy, circular economy as possible, otherwise they don't want to rent them. Investor landlords who we work for, who buy those buildings and let them out, clearly need to have buildings which are as green as possible. In fact, if we have buildings which are not up to a decent standard, they will struggle to be let, they will struggle to create a rental value, and their asset value will fall as well. And if they're in really bad condition from the environmental perspective, they may well become a stranded asset for the owner of those buildings. So it's an absolute imperative to drive the green agenda, and there is an absolute lockstep between revenue and profit growth and the green agenda when it comes to this issue. For sure, we've seen that hugely accelerate over the last year.
That's really encouraging to hear. Thanks, Ben. And Katie or Fran, obviously you're a client-focused business as well. Is there anything you'd like to add to that question about seeing any extra success?
Yes, I think we're hopeful that we will see extra success. I think there's probably work for us to do on how we communicate and explain and our journey, and actually doing this with you guys has been very helpful in that, Laura, because it has taken that opportunity to us to reflect outside the day-to-day of projects and bids and everything else. So I think that there's things for us to do, like Francis touched on. Procurement rules can be very restrictive in some instances. It can be quite difficult to demonstrate quite what we have done, but we're hopeful that we'll be able to do that and see some extra kudos and benefit come for what we have achieved.
Fantastic. And obviously Ben's on hand to offer the support there as well. So
absolutely, yes, and it'll be good to engage with Ben, and what Charlotte mentioned about forums and roundtable discussions is exactly where we want to move to, and see how we can work collectively together with other organisations in Birchwood. We've been there since 1997, so we're pretty long-standing. We're keen to get back there when we're able to, and yeah, it'll be good to all work together on that.
Yeah, Ben raised an interesting point there about office space, business property, etc. And it's true, obviously Birchwood is very much a product of the kind of 1970s and 80s, with the low building standards that they had then. Obviously there is new build that's happening, but a lot of the office stock is quite dated, and we have an issue. Obviously, we're on a long lease. You know, we're stuck with the landlord we have and their choices on energy supply and their choices on insulation, which is pretty poor for us, to be honest. So these things take a while to turn around. Now, Warrington Council are now actively investing in property for their pension funds. And so that whole sector of property, office, commercial, it's like an ocean liner. It takes 10 years, I think, to start turning that around and retrofitting. So that is an area definitely I would like to see government do more push to get, you know, office, commercial property, warehouses, all that sort of thing, much better retrofitted and insulated, that sort of thing.
Thanks, Francis. That's great. Just two more questions before we close. The first one for Signe and the second for Charlotte. So Signe, coming to you, what do you think is the right balance between public and private money in building back greener?
I think that there's obviously, I think, crucially an important role for both. I think that government will have an important role in leading from the front and investing in some of these, apologies, emerging technologies that will see upfront investment in order for us to figure out the role that it plays in terms of our decarbonisation journey. It has a crucial role in terms of investing in skills development and support for people during this transition. But then the bulk of kind of the challenge, I think, that's been identified by the Committee on Climate Change will need to also come from the private sector. And that is a very important piece of this. And there are businesses who are pioneering in their industries and sectors that are looking to invest, but there are some mechanisms that can be introduced at a national level to further facilitate that. We have talked about procurement policy a fair bit today, and I think that that is an absolutely important area, but also there is something around integrating a more active consideration around climate, but also nature in investment decisions that businesses take, and have a better understanding of how that can facilitate further economic growth. We saw earlier this month, actually, the publication of the Dasgupta review, which was led by Treasury, which very much makes this case that we need a fundamental rethink of how we measure economic growth. And this is something that will be very important in terms of unlocking private sector money, because if they better understand the return on investment, they can direct their investments accordingly. There's some other bits as well, but I think that those will kind of be the key bits that I would say in terms of that sort of challenge between private and public money.
Thanks, Signe. What a great answer. And thanks for bringing up the Dasgupta review as well. We hadn't talked about that today. And Charlotte, just coming to you finally for our last question, if that's okay. This was a pre-submitted question, which is: the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill presents an opportunity for businesses to galvanise action on a scale not seen since the Climate Change Act in 2008. So given your position on the Business Select Committee, do you think you might consider supporting the bill for its purpose in creating sustainable domestic and international supply chains?
I think on the specifics of the bill itself, if I'm not mistaken, it's a private members bill, which unfortunately means at the moment that it's not really going anywhere in terms of the sort of procedures of the House during coronavirus. There are a number of really good private members bills, including this one, and there's another which was submitted by Paula Barker in Wavertree around paying conditions and national minimum wage enforcement for people that work in the care sector, for example, which have just sort of been kicked into the long grass for the time being because private members bills aren't being progressed. But I think that it's important that we don't look at any one singular piece of legislation as being kind of the silver bullet in terms of achieving the goals that are, set out in that bill, because I think that we've got a number of opportunities in Parliament and a number of levers that we're able to pull on everything from, the Energy White Paper, which has recently come out, through to the work that's being done by the government around energy more broadly. I think there needs to be much better cooperation between BEIS and DEFRA, for example, because unfortunately where energy falls in BEIS but the environment falls in DEFRA, there's a lot of stuff that kind of fits across the wider decarbonisation piece that kind of falls between the cracks of those two departments, because kind of both are responsible for it but neither are at the same time, so you end up with this sort of Schrodinger's policy. So I mean, I'm happy to look at the specifics of the climate change and ecological emergencies bill, but I think that, as I said, you know, if it ends up that private members' bills won't be considered for another, you know, 6 months, 12 months potentially, that we don't lose that time by focusing on sort of one bill when there's other things that we can be doing at the same time. I'm sorry that feels like it's a little bit of a cop-out answer, but it's very frustrating at the moment, sort of the way that Parliament's operating. I mean, I'm sat here and I've got half an eye on my iPad because I'm being beamed into the virtual chamber for education questions shortly. But, you know, it's very piecemeal. You know, a lot of the ways that we would raise certain issues through things like Westminster Hall debates haven't been happening for a while, and they're due to be coming back next month. And it's kind of getting that momentum going behind policy objectives outside of coronavirus has been very difficult this year. But I'm really hopeful that that's starting to improve, and, you know, as many partners as we've got locally and making the case for all of these things, I think the better we are for it.
Thanks, Charlotte. Thanks for all your thoughts on that. We really appreciate it. And thank you again for all our speakers contributing so thoughtfully to all that discussion. So back over to Emma now to bring us to a close.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. And thank you all for providing like such brilliant answers to those questions. We had a whole heap more, so potentially we can get you guys to submit some written responses to those and we can circulate them. But that does bring this morning's event to a close. Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you found the presentations and the discussion really insightful and really interesting. We'd really love to know what actions you and your organisation are planning on taking or hoping to take following the presentations and the discussion today. So please do keep in touch with us at Hope for the Future, or get in touch with TEP, Business Declares, the Aldersgate Group, and of course do get in touch with Charlotte if you're in Warrington North. So please look out for a follow-up email that will be coming out tomorrow. That will give you more information on how Hope for the Future can support you and link you to some of our great online resources. When this browser closes, a feedback form will pop up. So if you do have a couple of minutes, please do fill it in. We really appreciate it. And all that's left to say is thank you to all of our wonderful speakers. You've been really fantastic. Thank you to our constituency team at TEP, Charlotte Nichols, and our Hope for the Future team behind the scenes. And a huge thank you to everyone who attended and everyone who's watching this recording on our YouTube channel or on Facebook. So enjoy the rest of your Thursday, and thanks so much again.